and so we're really looking forward to her speak. And so here's Andy Smith.
Thanks very much for the organizers of this event and working with my extremely impossible schedule. And thanks to the Native peoples on whose land we stand. So today I was just going to share a little bit about kind of what I've learned in terms of organizing against violence against women of color. These are not really my ideas per se, because I don't think anybody's ideas are just their ideas, but these are ideas that have kind of emerged out of collective struggle and are not necessarily a solution, but just maybe some things to put on the table, to open a discussion over how we can look at how we can end violence against women of color. So I will just begin with how we originally started to organize around the issue of violence. Many years ago, I used to be the Women of Color Caucus Chair for the National Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And our approach at that time was to kind of use a model of inclusion. Please include us in your services. Please include us in your model. So that often resulted in putting a medicine wheel on the 40-hour domestic violence training and calling that a native model. Basically, we add a little spice to the pre-existing structures, and that was supposed to be inclusive. We also tended to organize around what I call kind of a women of color caucus approach. This could be any kind of caucus, where you're kind of a caucus attached to a larger body. And what happens is you spend a lot of time yelling at the people in the larger structure about being racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise problematic. And if you yell at them very eloquently, they pay you to yell at them. So this happened every year. We got paid to yell at them for being racist. And then they would nod appreciatively, keep doing the same thing, until next year when we would yell at them again and get paid once again. This could be financially lucrative, but nobody actually changed their policies, right? Because they didn't think we were going anywhere, so they didn't feel the need to change. So this is when we all got together and said, this is getting a little tired after the past 20 years. What else can we do? And we said, well, what if we don't do our work in reaction to what the mainstream movement is doing? What if we don't try to be included in what they're doing? And what if we even just stop arguing with them? What if we just said, what do we want to do? If we wanted to build a movement to end violence against women of color, what would it look like? What if we don't presume anything? What if we don't presume shelters? What if we don't presume hotlines? What if we don't presume any of the existing strategies? And just ask ourselves, starting from ground zero, what would it take to end violence against women of color? So when we did that, when we did kind of this recentering approach, the first thing we started to see was that we could not address gender violence, such as domestic or sexual violence, without looking at how it intersected with state violence. Because when we look at the histories of oppression against women of color, we see that the state has been the primary perpetrator of violence against us. And when we look at the history of Indian massacres, we see that they were always accompanied by rape and sexual mutilation, because the goal was not just to kill Native peoples, but to kill our sense of even being a people. Right? Sexual violence was a key strategy that rendered Native bodies inherently rapeable, and by extension, their lands inherently invadable and their resources inherently extractable. If we look at the legacy of slavery, we cannot look at that without the enforced rape of African American women to keep the slavery system going. We cannot look at the history of immigrant exploitation without looking at the sexual exploitation of immigrant workers. So when we start to see this, we realize that it kind of doesn't make sense to think that the state is going to be the solution to the problems it has created and continues to benefit from. And this is where we started to hit kind of a contradiction, because when we look at the mainstream anti-violence movement, its primary strategy for ending violence was to work with the state. Right, let's get more police involved, let's get longer prison sentences, etc. This is supposed to help solve the problem of gender violence. Well, the reason why we then developed this Women of Color analytic is that we realize that this becomes important not just for ending violence against women of color, but for ending violence generally speaking. Because we realize that prisons aren't just not working to end violence against women of color, they're not working, period. They're not an effective way of addressing violence or addressing so-called crime, etc. And to give my 2-minute version of why we should not support the prison industrial complex. In case we're not familiar with it, let's think of why people are in prison, right? Primarily drug-related crimes. Well, what do you get drug treatment facilities in prisons? No, you can often get the drugs easier in prison. Also, people are often there for poverty-related crimes. Well, what does going to prison do but give you a prison record and make it less likely you can get a job and make it more likely you will stay in the system? And when we look at the issues of gender violence, well, if the problem was we have a few wacko people we need to lock up, maybe prisons might make sense. But when you have studies in which half of them say they would rape somebody if they thought they could get away with it, you either have to lock up half the male population, which is not feasible, or you realize that we have a rape culture that supports gender violence. And hence what we have is not a criminal justice problem, we have a political problem, right? We have to politically transform our society and communities so that they no longer tolerate violence. And yet, when we look at the story of the anti-violence movement, it has not developed this holistic response. When the anti-violence movement first develops, there is kind of a grassroots impulse to it, right? Do you need shelter? Maybe you can stay in my basement. Is there somebody who's perpetrating against you? Maybe we'll go to their workplace and harass them until they cut it out. There's kind of a sense that we can organize to end gender violence, but pretty soon, the state comes in being the sneaky thing that it is, and says, little ladies, it looks like you all have a problem with violence, and we'd like to help you solve that problem with a federal grant. Of course, when you accept the federal grant, you accept all the stipulations that go with this grant. So we will not be funding any unseemly rabble-rousing activities. No, the problem is that victims are sick, and they need healing from somebody with a PhD or an MSW. You cannot heal yourselves. You need an expert to heal you. And if you want to do any activist work, the activist work you will do is to be working with the criminal justice system, calling for longer prison sentences, more police involvement, because as it so happens, we are currently building up the prison industrial complex, and we need to co-opt your feminist rhetoric to support our repressive anti-crime agenda. And so before you know it, you have domestic and sexual assault programs actually located in police departments, effectively operating as arms of the state. So it no longer becomes possible for these programs to organize against, say, police violence, because they're working with the police. We can no longer even see the state as a site of violence, because the state is supposed to be the solution to the problems that we are facing. So this is when we need to see, we have to kind of step back and say, hey, is there a different approach that we can use that will holistically address the structures of violence that impact us? So at this time when we first started to develop, particularly through the group Incite Women of Color Against Violence, we did not really know exactly what to do. So we looked at some of the current models, particularly the restorative justice model. And these had many important insights for us. Kind of the principle of restorative justice is if there is a crime, it's not just about a perpetrator and a victim, right? But there's been a breakdown in the community, and hence instead of taking a person out of the community and making it less likely they're going to follow the norms of that community, you want to engage the whole community in holding people accountable. And these models are often tremendously successful, but the problem is when it comes to gender violence, restorative justice approaches tend to work if the community actually agrees that what happened was bad. But when we talk about gender violence, people often blame the victim rather than the perpetrator, and they're not willing to hold that person accountable. So when we talk about community accountability, we cannot assume a community that's not sexist, homophobic, or otherwise problematic, and we can't even assume a community to begin with, right? So instead of essentially restoring a community that may or may not even exist, we might actually have to transform or create communities of accountability. There isn't going to be kind of a model social service programming we can easily adopt. Again, this becomes a political organizing problem. How do we create communities that no longer tolerate violence? So this is when we started to do activist institutes around the country. And we would ask communities, well, if you were to see violence in your community, is there something you could do that would not just first be calling the police? And one thing that struck me at one of these institutes is that one woman said, you know, this is actually happening to me right now. There's somebody in my apartment complex that I can tell is beating his partner, and I don't know what to do because I don't trust the police, but I also don't want the violence to continue. And what her words made me realize is how our reliance on the criminal justice system had not just isolated victims of violence, but it had also isolated us who might think to intervene. Because it never occurred to us, her, or as often it doesn't occur to us, to organize the apartment complex to do something at that effect, right? If you ask yourself the question, what can I do? Well, there's often not much you can do other than call the police or do nothing. But if you ask yourself the question, what can we do? Then we started to find a lot of creative ideas begin to develop. And I think it's important to stress as we were doing this work that this is a positive project rather than a negative project. In other words, the question was not, if somebody's under attack, should they call the police? That's not the question. The question is, why have we given them no other options but to call the police? So our goal is not, if somebody's under attack, they have to decide what they need to do in that particular moment. Our goal is to create other alternatives that actually work and that actually address violence at the root cause, so that we no longer have to rely on a violent system that actually doesn't end violence in the long term. So as we started to do this work, and people started to develop their own community accountability strategies, and in fact we haven't set the dates or times yet, but in 2014 we will be having a National Community Accountability Conference. Anybody's interested in helping to organize, let me know. But anyway, the idea is that many of these community accountability projects have been going on for a while, and we're going to have a gathering for them to kind of get together and say, like, how do we take this to the next level? Like, what's going wrong, what's working, what are our barriers, what are the difficulties, so that we can kind of see what's the next generation of work that needs to happen, and that will take us further to where we want to go. But in any case, as we've been doing this work, we start to realize that community accountability has more radical ramifications, because we realize that the prison industrial complex is really an arm of a nation-state form of governance that's based on the logics of violence, domination, and control. And this is where the work of indigenous feminists in particular have been really key to the community accountability model, because they have put forth the idea that there are other forms of governance that we can imagine. We can imagine nations that are not nation states. Right? We can imagine nations that are not based on these exclusivist principles of we're in, you're out, screw the rest of the world, that are not ordered under these logics of social hierarchy, but we can understand nations as expansive projects that are about relationship with all of the world and are about horizontal and more democratic authority. So I'll just cite a quote here from Ingrid Shinawatra. She kind of explains this principle of sovereignty. She says, "We understand the concept of sovereignty as woven through a fabric that encompasses our spirituality and responsibility. This is a cyclical view of sovereignty, incorporating it into our traditional philosophy and a review of our responsibilities. This differs greatly from the concept of Western sovereignty, which is based on absolute power. For us, absolute power is in the creator and the natural order of all living things. Our sovereignty is related to our connections to the earth and is inherent." And I think Lakota Hardin frames it this way when she says, indigenous sovereignty is based on freedom for all peoples. Quote, "If it doesn't work for one of us, it doesn't work for any of us. The definition of sovereignty means that none of us are free unless all of us are free." Now, key to this different understanding of nationhood is a different conceptualization of land. That is, often when we talk about land-based struggle, the response is always about giving land back, right? But Mishana Goldman and Patricia Montour-Angus have argued that indigenous nationhood is not actually based on ownership or control of land, but is based on responsibility and relationship with the land. According to Montour-Angus, quote, "Although Aboriginal peoples maintain a close relationship with the land, it is not about control of the land. Earth is mother and she nurtures us all. It is the human race that is dependent on the earth and not vice versa. Sovereignty, when defined as my right to be responsible, requires a relationship with territory and not a relationship based on control of that territory." What must be understood then is that the Aboriginal request to have our sovereignty respected is really a request to be responsible. I don't know of anywhere else on earth where anywhere else in history where a group of people have had to fight so hard just to be responsible. So this is the trap that we often get into in the U.S. legal system, right? When there's encroachment on indigenous land, the only thing you can say is, it's not your land, it's our land. The question you don't get to say is, why should anybody get to own the land? Why should land be a commodity that anybody should get to buy or sell? Right? And this is how we end up getting trapped in what Glenn Coulthard, a Dene scholar, who has been voted tallest and smartest person in Native studies, has said we end up getting trapped into the politics of recognition, which I will now diagram for you. So here's my picture of global oppression. So we have 5% of the population that owns 95% of the wealth. The bad news is they have all the money and the guns. But the good news is there's a lot more of us than them. But the catch is we actually have to get the 95% mobilized to change this pyramid system. But the system, of course, wants to keep itself stable. So what it does is it goes to each oppressed group and it says, hey, oppressed group, you look very cool, interesting, and spiritual to us. We suspect you may be quadruply oppressed. If you can prove how special and oppressed you are, we will recognize you. We may give you a grant, we may give you some land, we may give you some resources. However, this other group also claims to be spiritual and oppressed. We think they may actually be more oppressed than you, so you better make sure you're really oppressed or we may recognize them instead of you. So we all end up in these competitions for recognition because our goal is to get this system to recognize us. Ironically then, Glenn Coulthard argues, we claim that we're fighting for liberation, self-determination, and sovereignty, but we're actually assuring the colonization will continue because we're relying on this system to recognize us. It never occurs to us, why don't we get these groups to recognize us? Why don't we start to recognize each other so that we can get this 95% mobilized and kick out these folks altogether? Actually, I should quote some of the quotes. So to end with a quote, he puts it this way: the key problems with the politics of recognition when applied to the colonial context is that it rests on the problematic assumption that the flourishing of indigenous peoples as distinct and self-determining agents is somehow dependent on their being granted recognition and institutional accommodation from the surrounding settler state and society. Not only will the terms of recognition tend to remain the property of those in power to grant to their inferiors in ways they deem appropriate, but also under these conditions, the indigenous population will often come to see their limited and structurally constrained terms of recognition granted to them as their own. In essence, they come to identify with white liberty and white justice. The other impact I think this has, besides keeping the system in place, is that it also goes hand in hand with maintaining heteropatriarchy within our communities and within society at large. Because a key building block to the social hierarchy is heteropatriarchy. And to see these connections, we will now turn to the Christian right, who will explain it to us. This is from Charles Colson, who was a former Christian right activist, who explained why the cause of terrorism is same-sex marriage. Quote, marriage is the traditional building block of human society intended to unite couples and bring children into the world. Marriage is not a private institution designed solely for the individual gratification of its participants. If we fail to enact a federal marriage amendment, we can expect not just more family breakdown, but more criminals behind bars and more chaos in the street. It's like handing more weapons of mass destruction to those who would use America's depravity to recruit more snipers, more hijackers, and more suicide bombers. We must preserve traditional marriage in order to protect the United States from those who would use our depravity to destroy us. Similarly, World Magazine, which is a Christian right magazine, explained that the cause of the Abu Ghraib prison crisis was feminism. Because feminism causes women to become disoriented about their gender roles, join the army, and abuse prisoners. So what these wise men are explaining to us is that heteropatriarchy is the building block of empire, because it is what naturalizes other forms of social hierarchy. That is, just as men are supposed to naturally rule women over the basis of biology, so too should the elites of society naturally rule everyone else. So, for instance, when we look at the history of indigenous colonization, we can see that that always accompanied with instilling patriarchy into Native communities, because colonists routinely complained that Native communities were not only not patriarchal, but were not generally social hierarchical. Well, if your society is not very hierarchical, why would you accept colonial domination from some other place? Right? You only live under conditions of domination when they seem natural. When they no longer seem natural, when you realize you could get a better deal somewhere else, you will go to that other place. So this is why it was so important to instill patriarchy in Native communities. It was not just to oppress Native peoples, but it was actually to wipe out the alternative for European societies. Right? European patriarchy could not be stable if European peoples realized they could also get a better deal somewhere else. So to secure the patriarchy of European societies, it was necessary to destroy the alternative that seemed to exist within indigenous communities. So then, given kind of this larger framework then, what does this say about what kind of politics might emerge from this, or what kind of organizing strategies might emerge? And I think into looking at this, we have to kind of approach this through what I would call revolution through trial and error. That is, well, if we really knew how to end global oppression, we would have done it by now. So let's just admit we really don't know what we're talking about, and let's just try stuff and see what happens, right? So I think with that, we try to kind of avoid kind of this revolutionary vanguard elite approach that says, I know the way to the revolution, you must follow me or nothing will work. And instead kind of approach this with a spirit of humility to see, well, let's try things, let's learn from our mistakes, and let's see where we can go from here. So kind of in that spirit, I'm just sharing some of the ideas that have come out, the people organizing around these principles, what are they doing, and what's happening. So a key thing we see particularly amongst indigenous peoples in Latin America is that they've adopted the approach of taking power by making power. These approaches developed in reaction to what they called the machismo-leninismo model of organizing. They said this was the idea, we're going to get our guns, go to the mountains, and take over the state. Said it sounded like a great idea, but the problem was the state had more guns than they did. Two, these movements were so hierarchical that even if they did get the state, they ended up replicating the same hierarchies they were opposing in the first place. And three, they weren't very inclusive because not that many people can actually get guns, go to the mountains, and take over the state. So, in fact, when we met with folks in Chiapas, they said that very same thing. We thought we could get our guns and take over the state, and they realized we were outnumbered in terms of the gun department. They said, but what if we just started to live differently? What if we started to create the world we want to live in now? What if we divested from the system, started to do our own health care, our own education? What if we developed a governance system we actually want to live under that's not horizontal and hierarchical, but is more egalitarian? But the key thing is here, that's different than what we often see in the U.S., it would not be enough to have kind of a cool, hippie, groovy commune zone, where we do our own cool little thing and screw the rest of the world. So no, if we build our own territories, we need to proliferate them. So if we get a place living in a different way, then some people have to go and start another place and keep growing and growing and growing. If we all started to live differently, well, what could the guns do? If 90% of the world says we're not going to live under these principles, then eventually we would be able to take power because we would be squeezing out the system essentially. So some of the approaches then became, in a certain way, more creative, saying, what is the world we want to live in? Let's start to practice the future we want to bring into being. So, for instance, one movement is the landless movement in Brazil. When we met with them, this is a movement that's taking over land that's not being used. And this movement has hundreds of thousands of families involved in it. Well, when they're occupying these lands, they can't go to the police if there's a problem because the police are trying to kick them off. So, do I need to switch now? Pardon me, we'll have a little break, sure. Okay? Okay. So consequently, they started to do is build their own governance system. And they have a man and woman in charge of each sector of society, but they make sure that leadership is rotating so nobody has all of the power. And this is kind of important because we know abuse and violence tends to happen when power is consolidated. Also, the people who enforce security are women who carry around machetes. Now, this is kind of important because it also makes people rethink women as necessarily always vulnerable to violence, rather than women being able to resist violence. And in addition, if there's a problem, if there seems to be, say, abuse going on in a household, everybody rings the bell and goes and circles that household, so that things can't be done in isolation, because as we also know, abuse tends to happen in isolation. If everybody knows what's going on with you, it's harder to get away with things. Anyway, the important thing that we learned about this is that they said, it's not like there's a magic bullet or a panacea that everything is perfect, but they noticed that the longer we live this way, the less violence happens in the first place. And this can be instructive to us because our programs are all designed to intervene after the violence has occurred. But what they are showing us is that we can actually create different social structures that stop the violence from happening in the first place. Another example I'll mention is the factory movement in Argentina, where people started to take over factories directly. They did not wait for the state to do something. They said, we will just take over it, we'll develop our own economic system, and with that our own governance system, because we'll start organizing not just the work we're doing in the factory, but how we're going to live with each other, develop relationships among factories, etc. Anyway, one friend of mine went to visit this a factory. She had just given birth, so she was breastfeeding, and she went to sign up for a task. Everybody was supposed to sign up for a work task. And they said, you're already working, you're breastfeeding. Like, we count that as work. Right, so this is a different example where all work is valued. It's not just the work that's valued under the capitalist system, but caregiving, all these other things that actually require a lot of work starts to be seen as work that we actually need to share. So with that, then we can ask ourselves, well, how could this translate into the U.S. system? How could we develop kind of these growing movements that can kind of replace the current system? And I think the problem we have is that our organizing is very much organized through a nonprofit model. So now I will draw a diagram of the nonprofit industrial complex. Okay, so what we have here is we have kind of our highway of capitalism and colonialism. Everybody's driving along in their SUV gas-guzzling cars, messing up the world with everything else, right? But the problem is that some of us here, we don't really want to do this. We want to be nice to everybody else. We don't want to be on this evil highway of colonialism. However, the problem is we actually live in the belly of the beast. So the system cannot really afford for us to be organized, because if we really were seriously organized, we could really transform the global system. But also, because we live in the belly of the beast, the system here has a lot of resources to dedicate to how it should solve this problem. So what it does for us is it builds an alternative highway where we can drive along in our Toyota Prius cars, eat granola food, and feel very countercultural. And we fail to notice that we are driving in circle. They built the highway for us, and this highway is still going along. So this is essentially what we see with the nonprofit industrial complex. They recognize that we have an impulse to do better, so they say, we will fund your impulse to do better through these foundation grants. Of course, when we have foundation grants, who do we answer to? We answer to the funders. We don't answer to the people we supposedly represent. Well, if it comes back to this system, if we really want to end this system, we have to get people mobilized. Our work cannot just be talking to people who agree with us. We have to get people who don't agree with us. We have to be building, building, building. If we get funded the same amount, regardless of how many people we actually represent, we don't have an incentive to get the 95% mobilized. So that is why our movements often don't grow. We don't have the financial incentive we would have if our constituents were the ones that were actually funding the movement. And then we see, of course, a lot of other ramifications that happen through this system. foundation grants tend to fund specific strategies, and strategies that are the least problematic for the system. And so what happens if you recognize your strategy doesn't actually work? Well, if they don't like that, then you don't get to be funded anymore. Or oftentimes you may recognize the strategy doesn't work and you want to change, but you can't admit it because if you admit failure to your funder, they won't refund you. So you tell everybody it was a spectacular success and everybody believes it. They try it too, it didn't work for them either, but they tell the funder it worked too so they can get refunded, and pretty soon you're kind of proliferating disaster. And finally, the foundation kind of system tends to privilege people who have the educational background to go schmooze with funders, fill out 5,000 reports, etc., rather than organizers who may not have that experience. So we tend to build kind of a class system within the nonprofit system that values people who have a certain educational background versus those who may not, but may be very excellent organizers. So in the end, what tends to happen is that we build this model of career organizing, where we think we need to get paid to do the job. But if we look at this system, what we need, obviously this whole 95% can't get paid to organize. So what we end up happening is 2 or 3 people who are working 5,000 hours a week that are trying to replicate the work that hundreds of thousands of people need to be doing, who get all burnt out and cranky because they're getting overworked and then drive everybody else bonkers, right? So consequently, we need to rethink kind of our organizing structure. And this actually, I think, leads to some of the issues that particularly, how many people here are associated with the academic industrial complex in some way? Okay. So, you often hear this, I'd like to be an activist, but I'm just too sick, tired, busy, and depressed, right? But if we're going to organize around everybody who's not sick, tired, busy, and depressed, we have 2 people to end global oppression, right? So this is why we need to rethink what we think organizing is, right? If we think organizing is this career activist model of working 80 hours a week, well, no, you can't do 2 different jobs. But if we had millions of people doing half an hour a week, right, that would seem sustainable. And it would be something that would actually have a bigger impact because we would have so many more people doing it. In fact, I remember at one World Social Forum, an activist from Chile, they were making a speech and they said, we laugh at people in the U.S. Folks in the U.S. get very excited, they get 200 people to a rally on police brutality, and then they go get a police permit to march against police brutality. What good does that do? They said, in Chile, we got 1 million people out each week when Pinochet came to power. That would be the equivalent of 40 million people out in the U.S. each week. But this is the kind of scale we need to be bringing up to. So the nonprofit model puts a container on it. It makes it never possible we could ever get those 40 million people. So we need a different organizing framework that is not where you need to leave your life to become an organizer, but organizing becomes part of the life that you lead. Well, what are some of the barriers to this is that, and I kind of was alluding to this when I was talking about the factory movement, is that we tend to think of collective organizing in a very narrow frame. So we tend to think, well, if we have a protest, we'll go organize for the protest. If we need a petition drive, we'll organize for the petition drive. Like things that are in the kind of the public sphere. But when we think about daycare, when we think about cooking, when we think about the things you need just to live your life, that's on your own time. That's something you should do by yourself. Well, particularly if you don't have a lot of resources, particularly women in particular, well, you don't have time to do all those things that you need to do just to survive on your own time and go do this collective organizing. But what if we collectively organized everything? If we collectively organize the daycare, the cooking, the things we need to do just to survive, then it would free up everybody's time to do other work as well. So let's, again, think of the academic industrial complex. You're trying to get through tenure, and you're supposed to write 50 books in the next year. You're a student, you got 10 million finals, and 1,000 people just read a week, right? It sounds a little daunting to do this and then do activist work. And that's why everybody says, don't do that activist work. Wait until X date happens when you'll be free to do that work, which will actually never occur. But what if instead we actually started to collectively do the teaching, collectively do the homework, collectively do the work we do in the academic industrial complex? What if we did that work differently? What if we didn't do organizing on the side, but we integrated organizing into the work we're already doing here, right? What if organizing was part of the homework, right? Then we would be free to do a lot of more creative things that would kind of free up our opportunities so that it wouldn't seem like a strain, but would be integrated into the life that we're already living. So this finally leaves me with the final point is that if we're going to get the millions of people involved, besides doing the organizing work differently, we really need to build a more fun revolution. So this is what I learned, again, from the Christian right, because this, I don't know if anybody ever heard of the Promise Keepers. They're still around, but not as popular as they were a while ago. But they used to be this evangelical men's movement, and they would have these huge stadium rallies, and I would go to these things for part of my research, and I was really struck by how much fun they were. They were like, there was popcorn and Cracker Jacks and hot dogs, everybody was singing and dancing, and everybody was nice and friendly to you, and you'd see like poor Stan had a problem with pornography, nobody yelled and said, you're going to burn in hell, and they say, Stan, we want you to be the Christian you want to be, so we're here to support you, we have your back, you know. So after I'd go to visit these things, then I would go to progressive meetings. These meetings lasted like 4 hours long, in these very uncomfortable chairs, and no food, and everybody yelled at you for being counter-revolutionary. And then we wondered why nobody wanted to join. So this is a problem that we have. This a little bit comes from the nonprofit model, right? If you have the idea, revolution's around the corner, throw away your life, suspend your life, work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week until the revolution happens. This lasts for about 2 weeks before you want to run off to the day spot, right? So if we want to build a movement that's going to be sustainable over the long haul, it has to actually be fun. It has to be something that's going to sustain us. It has to be something that gives to us as much as we give to them. I mean, if part of the goal is to build the world we want to live in, we can start doing that now. We can start to create the world that is actually fun and joyous, that mirrors the world that we're trying to bring into being. This helps other people join because they don't think you're just a bunch of lunatics who don't like to have any fun. They say, oh, I see why you want to join the revolution because I see a glimpse of what the revolution would be in the way you're living now. Right? So our goal then becomes, how can we build a revolution that is so much fun that people can't wait to join? So in conclusion then, all of these ideas can seem very pie in the sky. We're often faced with very immediate, pressing concerns of life or death consequence. And I've noticed in movements there often tends to be the split between people who are doing so-called reform strategies and those who are doing so-called revolutionary strategies. They seem to be two different things and never the twain shall meet. And I would argue that no, these long-term visions are actually central to even reform strategies. Because if you don't have a long-term vision of where you want to go, you don't know if your short-term strategies are actually working. And I would argue that if we had a long-term vision of where the anti-violence movement was going, a lot of the strategies we had developed, we would have dumped a long time ago. So to give you one example, I was at an anti-domestic violence conference one time, and in one of the workshops, we were asked to envision what would we like to see 20 years from now. And everybody said things like more hotlines and more shelters, and nobody said less violence. Like we actually forgot why we were there. And if we had remembered that we were there to actually eradicate violence, we would have done some of these strategies that were actually increasing violence rather than eradicating it. And so if you don't have that long-term vision, you have no means to measure your short-term vision. And then in addition, I think we have to also recognize that the structures of oppression that we face, of colonialism and white supremacy, etc., have not just oppressed us, but they've also shaped our imagination of what we think can be possible. Right? It has shaped what we think can be possible so that anything that's really liberatory always seems impossible. So part of the task of anti-oppression work, part of the practice of decolonization is to decolonize our imagination, to be able to think outside the box, to imagine the unimaginable, so that we can actually bring it into being. Because if we can't even imagine it, then how do we work to make that happen? Of course, this will always be provisional. As we go along, we will learn more and more. We will start to see more how oppression has shaped our thinking. And all of our ideas have to be provisional because as we go along, we may realize, oh no, that wasn't a good idea. We've learned more ideas. And eventually the world that we create may be something now we currently can't even imagine. But we can certainly be part of a collective process that future generations can take on to bring this world into being. So finally, I will just end with a quote from Dylan Rodriguez, who puts it this way. Our job is to think the unthinkable, imagine the unimaginable, and make the impossible a reality. Thank you.
thank you for your comments. They're really amazing. Can you comment on the reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act, particularly on the provisions to give tribes jurisdiction against non-natives who commit sexual violence in their communities?
Can you say a little more about, I mean, I can, but can you say a little more, what's your thoughts and analysis about this?
It's being portrayed as an increase of tribal sovereignty. And from the right, there are a lot of voices arguing that it would violate the constitutional right of those non-native violent offenders. But with the framework you presented us of thinking outside of the system, not just giving tribal police increased power to arrest people or settle courts under PIA set up structures, what do you think, is that a useful step for us?
What do you think? I'm just curious. I mean, I just think I don't even think there's an answer, so I'm just.
Right. I think it's an important intermediary step. I think it helps people reflect on. It's ridiculous that we don't have those jurisdictions in the first place, but I don't know if it's really useful in just promoting this existing system to solve those measures.
Yeah, I think it's very messy, so I don't think there's a clear-cut thing. Kimberly Robertson just actually wrote a great dissertation on this very topic, on the issue, the kind of the complexities of VAWA. And actually, I think Sarah Deer is also, written on the complexities of this. So kind of the problem, of course, with VAWA is that it was actually attached to this larger anti-crime bill that was very problematic, right, that increased criminal sentencing, federal sentencing that actually disproportionately impacts Native peoples, impact people who are juveniles in particular, increase death penalty possibilities, right? And we didn't have any feminist critique of the rest of the bill that this was attached to. So this has been, I think, the problem with VAWA is that you put a anti-violence thing, the whole legislation suddenly becomes feminist, and we take off any kind of critical interrogation of kind of what's going on there. But then, I think, as you're rightfully pointing out, these provisions are been the work of a lot of Native organizers who do actually have an understanding of the complexities of it, right? And recognize we're not going to decolonize tomorrow, and that part of the practice of decolonization is getting federal authority more and more out, and state authority out of tribal communities so that they can start to practice doing the accountability themselves, right? So it may not be this monstrous step to decolonization, but if it gives more breathing space, is there not the possibility that Native nations will start to develop a practice around accountability by having more breathing space? And of course, that's precisely why the more conservatives don't want that to happen, because they see the possibilities there. But again, what this will rely upon is a movement to see this simply, as you're saying, as an intermediary step. Right? The danger is if we see this as the full step, we see VAWA, how we're free, not saying, hey, how can we use this as a short-term thing to start to put in mind our larger vision of where we want to go. And I think Sarah Deer's work, I think, is very interesting in terms of how she tries to think about how to use these as intermediary steps, right? So she was advocating, what if we focus on, now I'm losing my, protective orders, tribal protective orders. She's not saying this will solve the problem by any means, but if we start doing things like this that are, one, less likely to be scrutinized by the federal government, but two, just give tribal communities the practice of saying we can do something ourselves, it starts to spark the imagination that maybe there's something else we could do, right? So there's these possibilities, but there's always going to be these dangers, again, if we get more invested in the current system. And the other thing that she points out is our reaction often is that we're upset that under the current, well, now the Tribal Law and Order Act has been increased to only, 3 years in tribal jails for any particular crime, but they say, well, the problem is that we get mad because the U.S. took that away from us without asking, is that a thing we want in the first place? I mean, we're not prohibited from doing other ways of holding people accountable. We could think of other strategies that might work, but we only focus on prison because that's the thing that we don't have the right to do, rather than saying, well, maybe this isn't the best thing to do anyway, maybe there's something else we could do. So anyway, I think what you're saying is an excellent point, and just goes to show there's not an easy solution. It's going to be how we use these particular strategies, what's the dangers if we think that they're solution versus could they be a strategic opportunity to do something more interesting in the future. Did anybody else have any thoughts on this? I just think it's such a big, do you have thoughts on this?
One of the problems is that the
systems that are in power basically treat women and minorities as children or pets that need to be taught. And a lot of times the problem is that there's an almost innate acceptance of this attitude from the elites that we've inculcated through our schooling, through our culture, through what we were taught by our parents. We accept that we are lesser, and therefore we don't take the power that we do actually have.
I concur. I mean, like when I was talking about kind of the Women of Color Caucus organizing approach, I think one of the effects of the colonial legacies and other oppressive legacies is that we get used to complaining about what other people are not doing and say, we're going to do it ourselves. We'll take responsibility. Because in certain ways, the complaining is safer, right? Because if things go wrong, it's not your fault, right? Whereas when you take control of it and you blow it, you have to say, oops, I blew it. And I remember, just to give you one example, I was in this group, a reproductive rights group, and we basically realized that there was a women of color majority at some point, and we could actually take over. And the day before we took over, I was petrified, because it was so comfortable to complain about the white women and how retro they were. I'm like, if we're in charge, we don't have nobody to complain to anymore. Like, people complain to us, right? And that's what actually happened. And then, to be honest, what happened was we did completely blow it. Like, we weren't used to being in charge, and we completely messed it all up. But that ended up being the most valuable experience to me, because when you get used to saying, no, we can actually take power, then you don't feel the need to complain anymore. You realize you have the power to do it. But at the same time, there's not a guarantee that that will be successful, and you have to be comfortable with failures, because 90% of things we do will fail, but the 100 thing that works may work because we learned from the 99 failures. Other thoughts? In the pink scarf. I can't see that.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have an announcement. My name is Peggy. I work with a lot of prisoners and their families, and a friend of mine, her son was murdered in Lewis Prison 2.5 years ago for being black, bisexual, and loving a Mexican. One of the issues that she's struggled with is there being an appropriate investigation of what happened to him in his homicide, but that leads into the issue of, you know, seeking justice from the criminal justice system, and so, or the civil system. She's also got a civil suit going, and needing to build a community where justice for prisoners who are in situations like Dana's, you know, and I hear from a lot of those prisoners in correspondence. We've put together the See Right Prison Justice Project, which is going to be meeting every Saturday at 4 o'clock at the Puente office at 1306 East Van Buren in Phoenix. And, you know, it's to look at the big picture. It's to be there. We're a resource for people who have loved ones in prison, particularly people struggling with getting health care, appropriate health care, or protective segregation. And to really talk about, you know, what alternatives can we build, you know, how can we make this a more just society so that more people like Dana don't end up dying in prison that way.
Thank you.
And I have flyers here. I'm going to put them on the desk up here for people.
There's somebody over here.
It seems to me that all this is premised on accepting violence. And we accept it from the government because they say they're doing it to protect us. To protect us from foreign powers and to protect us from ourselves. How do we break out of that?
I think you got it. Well, continue on. I think you got the idea. What do you think?
What do I think of it? I don't know. You've been so long. I don't.
Well, I mean, what do people think? What would be needed to start to make violence not seem like natural, right? It's essentially a project of denaturalizing violence. So I mean, I think what we wanted to take. How about this? Take 30 seconds. Talk amongst yourselves here. What would be needed to denaturalize violence? And we can share some ideas.
Maybe a sometimes when it's just like
But
you only have 3
you have
hours
some
and you have to
ideas
finish
you'd like to
something.
share with the whole group that came up?
Is this video gonna be on YouTube somewhere?
Probably. I'm probably happy to do some things for that.
Media, healing and healing thinking, like life, like gardens, like celebrate a woman giving life and talk about it to the women, to the young people. Like indigenous communities do, like puberty, like ceremonies, like talk to them about their power. I think that's gonna give power to the women because, in fact, we are the ones that give life.
I think that's a great idea, and that's an idea that's come up a lot with people doing kind of radical cultural work, right? In terms of, we often think of like cultural workers as artists, rather than all of us as being cultural workers and artists. Like what if we did our work as artists all the time? If when we create the space as a beautiful space, don't you just think about the space different? So if we start to make the world a beautiful world, we start to be different peoples in this beautiful world. So thanks for that, great idea. Is there any other ideas people like that?
I think shifting from a paradigm of fear to a paradigm of love as an oriented philosophy for society.
That sounds great. Yeah?
Empowering children, the disabled, all those other voices that aren't listened to in our society need a voice. They need to be allowed to speak. I mean, a 3-year-old, we're busy telling them what they should learn instead of asking them what they want to learn. We're killing that creative spark.
Well, and what you're speaking to is one, well, how can we integrate multi-generational things into events like this, right?
Yeah.
And also, how can we develop alternatives to the academic industrial complex? Because the very way we learn makes this suitable for capitalism. So I'll actually just call your attention to the Critical Ethnic Studies Association. We're developing alternatives to the academic industrial complex that's different ways of learning that are not based on kind of this hierarchical capitalist model that you can all join in on at www.criticalethnicstudies.org. I saw some ideas over here, yeah.
I was going to say, I think we need to go back, it has to do with education as well, go back to deconstructing and reconstructing what it means to be a human being. I think we got stuck in this social construction of concepts and operationalizing what it means to be a certain gender, certain minority group. I think we need to stop, focusing so much on that and being more focusing on the self-worth and what it means to actually be a human being and basic rights that will entitle to those to being a human being. So and educating that.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is so important too, and it reminds me when I was with the indigenous peoples that took over one of the World Social Forum from Latin America and made kind of this consensus statement. And they were framing college as kind of the epistemological project that you were talking about. Because they said the problem is with the Western subjects see themselves as who they're not, right? I know who I am because I'm not you, right? Well, it makes sense that if that's why I understand myself, then the nation I build from that sense of self is my nation, not your nation. He said, but indigenous peoples, we see ourselves in radical relationship to all things. So if we support the idea of radical relationality, that I know who I am because of my relationships with you and all of creation, then the nation I build from that will also be relational. It won't be you can't come into our land, rather it'll be what is our relationship to all of the world and how can we be in a good relationship with all of the world. So yes, I think the Western subject is a fundamental problem that often gives rise to all these other structures of expression. So thanks. Other thoughts? Yeah?
Singing to each other. When I find that when I sing to another person, with another person, I'm more in touch with just my inner core and our just innate connection. And violence just doesn't seem to flourish.
Right. In fact, that's what one group we met in India, how they de-escalated violence is that when they knew what was going on, they circled somebody's house and sang until the violence stopped. Yeah?
Well, I guess you could try to challenge yourself to redefine discipline. Like, I don't know, disciplining children and violence coming from that, or denaturalizing, I don't know, just physical means of correcting something.
Well, exactly, yeah, right, because what do you learn if somebody said, the person who's supposed to love you the most says, I have the right to hurt you? What is the fundamental message you learn, right? I mean, that's the thing, isn't that the military says we have the right to kill because we need to, right? So how do we kind of untrain that, what we learned from the very beginning? Yeah. Just interesting, is there any other hands, just to see, yeah?
I wonder if, like, making violence unnatural requires that we actually acknowledge the capacity of all people to do violence and respect that. That I think would be better. Some people did do more violence in terms of self-defense, and that definitely makes, well, makes people think twice if they think they're going to get hit back. If they think they're, and it doesn't have to be from an, self-defense doesn't have to be an individual thing. It can be a collective thing that requires respecting that different people have different capacities for self-defense, and that those are acknowledged and brought into that. But everybody has some capacity for that.
Right, and also I think you're also considering on the table, what do we call violence, right? Like, is self-defense violence in the first place? Or is there a tendency to call, when people who are oppressed do something, that's considered violent, but drinking Coca-Cola is not violent? Like, being complicit in everyday structures of violence, that's not violent. So I think also implicit in this is rethinking what we think violence is too on a systemic level. Yeah?
I think America has a love affair with sports events, and that is being created a philosophy of competition, and that at the ultimate level we think of life as being a strife and conflict, and that can be replaced by a culture of cooperation instead.
I think I have time for one more thing. Yeah?
Yeah, one complex that you didn't really mention is the military-industrial complex. And that complex has really controlled our country since Eisenhower. And Eisenhower even said, beware of the military-industrial complex after World War II, because he knew how strong it had actually gotten. And I think we have to tear it down. I mean, it's like starting wars and the whole element of propagating violence around the world. And that has to be shut down.
What were you saying with you, because I think you had been right.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just curious how maybe, because you write about this as well, about how we create these kinds of alternative communities instead of this just kind of reactionary framework. At the same time, like I've been to like a lot of hippie festivals in my day, like music festivals. I have a lot of friends who are like fire dancers and circus performers and call themselves bliss, and these are the kinds of things that they talk about like all the time, and these are beautiful, wonderful communities. At the same time, they also don't necessarily challenge structures of oppression or at times even reproduce it. These are largely very like white spaces that I'm thinking of, these kinds of hippie music festivals, love everybody. And I was just wondering if you had thoughts about those kinds of tensions, those sort of ideas that we're throwing out that sound a lot like this circle.
Well, yeah, so thank you for all the ideas. I think we should just keep thinking about this. But I think what I said previously is why, in terms of the hippie Ruby climbing zone, is that these things have to be proliferated. Like, it's not enough to create your own little safe space. It doesn't work unless it builds to a mass scale, right? So proliferation is a key thing. And I think that's maybe a thing that we should think about too when we do things. Like, for instance, when you're trying to, now we're thinking about alternatives to the academic industrial complex, and we're feeling like we don't really just want to start individual small projects, we need to start them all together, right? Because when we all start together, then it starts to be more of a challenge. So I think the key is to think about these alternatives at the bigger scale, maybe from the very beginning. Now, of course, this is not as easy as it looks because any global oppression turns out not to be as easy as it looks, right? So there's obviously not a quick solution, but I think all of your concerns, and I think you're also bringing an important concern, is that when you try to build the world you want to give, and the state won't say, gee, please dismantle me, right? We're not going to just sit around and let you do that, right? If it starts to build to a mass scale, then you have to consider what will be our forms of resistance to state repression. So I think these are just things we need to collectively think about, make that part of our practice. make it something we're always self-critiquing because we might think we have a good idea and we realize, oh, this is reaching a limit, we'll have to do something else. And just keep these as critical questions as we kind of go forward. So thank you all for your great ideas. I hope to keep working with you in the future, and thanks a lot.